Good evening, everyone. My name is Jorge Rojas. I'm Director of Learning and Engagement at the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's presentation of Manifest Destiny, the effect of our sea to shining sea expansion on our neighbors to the south. This is the third and last of 3 Mexican art and history classes created in a year-long partnership with Artes de México in Utah. The UMFA is proud to present this unique series of classes designed to explore Mexican history through art. The Utah Museum of Fine Arts is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of Native American people. We want to acknowledge the significance of place and the continued existence and contributions of indigenous people who have lived on and cared for this land for thousands of years. We also want to express our museum and university's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. We want to give special thanks to Utah Humanities, which has generously funded educational programming since 2010, empowering Utahns to improve their communities through active engagement in the humanities. Generous support for this project provided to UMFA by the Arts Bridge Foundation. The UMFA also gratefully acknowledges the support of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Utah and the Salt Lake City Public Library. And a very special thanks to our partners, Artes de México in Utah, for the very important work they do to educate our community about Mexican art, history, and culture. I also want to give a shout out to my colleague, Maggie Trilly, Coordinator of University and Adult Programs at UMFA, for coordinating the series of Zoom webinars. For those of you that are teachers that are joining us this evening, a new Zoom link will be sent out tomorrow for the follow-up discussion. Please use the new link for the 4 p.m. discussion that will take place on Wednesday, September 2nd. Actually, that might be Wednesday, September 3rd, sorry. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and will be posted online in a couple of weeks, so please look for that and help us share it. Our presenters are going to take questions after their presentation, so please type your questions in the chat and we will try to get to as many questions as we have time for. Now to introduce tonight's presenters. Susan Vogel is a freelance writer, journalist, and attorney. She holds a BA in English from San Francisco State University and a JD from Hastings College of Law. She also studied at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico City. She is the author of the first English language biography about the Utah Mexican artist Pablo O'Higgins. In 2010, after being involved in UMFA's exhibit Artes de México and its companion exhibit about Pablo O'Higgins, Susan co-founded the nonprofit Artes de México in Utah in the UMFA Cafe. A native of Mexico and graduate of the Instituto Politécnico Nacional, Fanny Guadalupe Blauer has worked as an accountant in Mexico and the US. She is board chair of Artes de México in Utah and a passionate presenter of cultural workshops. She works as community liaison at the Natural History Museum of Utah. Fanny recently earned an Anthropology of Art diploma from the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of Social Anthropology. James Courage Singer, Dene Navajo, is a diversity fellow in sociology and ethnic studies at Salt Lake Community College and a PhD student at Utah State University in the sociology program. His research is concerned with social mobility. James is an advocate for Indigenous peoples and the environment. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're so grateful to all of our panelists that are here. Just want to welcome you and thank you again for this amazing partnership and for this series. I turn over the time to you.
Great, thank you. This is Susan Vogel. And I want to thank you, Jorge and Maggie and the UMFA for allowing us to be here today and through this series. Thank you also for rescheduling. I am happy to report that everyone is well. I hope everybody else is too. So we're very honored to speak on this subject at this very difficult time, and also to have James Courage Singer present a Native American voice, which is rarely heard. Certainly I didn't hear it growing up. For me, it's been a real awakening being involved in this project and really looking at the myths that I absorbed growing up in the US and in Utah. So let's look at our first image. So this is a famous painting. It really captures the idea of manifest destiny and the idea of American exceptionalism, which is a pillar of our identity. The artist created it for a magazine, and it's been widely reproduced. The publisher describes the image as a beautiful and charming female floating westward through the air, bearing on her forehead the Star of Empire. In her right hand, she carries a book, the emblem of education and national enlightenment, while with her left hand, she unfurls a telegraph wire. The telegraphs are going to flash in intelligence throughout the land. So in spite of its lofty appearance, this painting is only about 12 inches by 17 inches. And this image absolutely represents the US history that I learned growing up in Utah during the Cold War to the Vietnam era. So it was a time of great American exceptionalism when we believed we knew everything that was best for the entire world. And it was spreading our democracy throughout the world, our Christian religion, and our capitalism worldwide. So life in Utah in public schools for me, from church to public events, holidays, was a nonstop celebration of the glory of us spreading from sea to shining sea, like this Columbia, named after Columbus, effortlessly and justly and righteously floating across the West. I don't ever remember learning about any damage that we left in the wake. This is a songbook that we learned growing up. We played in piano, and it's all about manifest destiny, Christianity, the glory of the West, and the glory of slavery. So I learned that we tamed these barbaric Indians that were hunting buffaloes when they attacked us, and they always started it. I learned that we entered treaties that were just and fair to expand our countries. And I was a Job's daughter in the Masonic temple. We used to sing "Onward Christian Soldiers." We didn't know what we were soldiers for, but apparently for Christianity. And in that context, we were against the Catholics and the Mormons too. So this westward movement was a great source of pride. And how could you not love these adventurous trappers, the darling cowboys? And I'm wearing a cowboy scarf right now for my friend Dan Harder, who's a cowboy. He's in San Francisco listening today. And then also for the scruffy miners, and then the long-suffering pioneers who they suffered so much, they surely did deserve the land that they came to. So when I studied in Mexico City, I started to get a different point of view that opened my eyes a bit, and Fanny will discuss that, but I never learned James's point of view. So Fanny, what are your thoughts about this painting?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I want to thank the UMFA for this space, for allowing us to reflect on the way we have learned our history and the social impacts that this has generated over time. I think art provides this lens of reflection and evaluation of ourselves, and analyzing this particular piece allows us to reflect our own biases that have been consciously and unconsciously built as we learn the history of our world. So the words that I have chosen to describe this painting have taken me to a deep reflection, especially since we have prepared for the class, having these previous meetings to prepare for the class with James. It's just been deeply, deeply painful, I have to say. So as I see this image, I ask myself, what is to be American? Who and what determines who is a true American? And honestly, I have to say this, it makes me think of a Barbie. Yeah, a Barbie doll. Is this what the image portrays? So we know that lesson plans and the school curriculums portrayed history always in the same way. Who are the heroes, the settlers? They have come to discover the Americas in the name of God, the Christian God, either North America or the rest of the American continent under the name of God. So school curriculums have focused on these three words as history has been taught: discovery, modernize, and civilized. And it's in this painting, the native people, you can see they are in the very corner of the left, in the darkness, moving away, painted small. They are barely there, minimizing the atrocities. So Colombia doesn't really look threatening or aggressive. She's just, I mean, look at her. She looks graciously gliding, bringing the light as she moves. She's representing God's will. She's representing the American beauty. And to me, she looks like, you know, I grew up Catholic, so she looks a lot like the saints in those Christian churches. So as I have studied the concept of manifest destiny and having conversations with the community and community members, I can simplify this painting with two main words: racism and greed. As I look back further under what represents the name of Columbus, or Colombia in this case, I was taught in Mexico that Christopher Columbus discovered America back in 1492. He discovered America, right? And we were encouraged to celebrate him every October 12th, the day of Columbus. So history classes in many ways were centered and have been centered and continue to be centered to honor Columbus, to embrace our Spanish heritage. So for me, this angelical view, as I analyze and go deep into the reflection, I don't want to call it colonialism. I would call it anti-indigenism and racism, which continues to affect many views of ourselves as people of color. As I moved to this country, I knew immediately that I looked different. Maybe in Mexico, I was light brown skin, as people like to classify. But here, I knew I looked different. And not only I look different, I look Mexican. And as people learned that I was Mexican, I had to justify in many ways who I was. I had to assimilate to the white behavior and the social expectation. I wanted to blend in because that's what is expected, right? So have you ever wondered how this contributes to the self-esteem or the self-image of people of color or the minorities? I truly believe that what we do and how we behave echoes generations. And this painting depicts the reality of what we're living today.
James, let's hear your perspective.
You know, I'd like to spend some time and when we get closer to my comments, but I do want us to point out something here. Just notice the contrast between light and dark in the coloring here. Notice the actions of the natives in the background here. I mean, you can see it looks like some of these Plains Indians are performing a ghost dance, and then we see the Indians fleeing before, along with the buffalo and other wildlife. And I think this is really illustrative of the concepts that we're going to be kind of delving into more. And I just want to point those out because I'll be talking about those specific things in a little bit.
Great, thanks, James. Let's go on to the next picture. So I'm going to add another myth. I'm going to layer it onto our U.S. Manifest Destiny myth. And that is what I call the Mormon Manifest Destiny myth. So remember from our last class on Mexican muralists that in the 1920s, the Mexican government hired muralists to create a new Mexican identity, a modern identity of Mexico, inclusive of all. So the muralists started with Mexico's oldest indigenous cultures way back to the Olmecs in about 3000 BCE, and they showed the violence and the struggles of Mexico throughout millennia. So our murals here in our state capitol, which I love the art, I love the Capitol building. They're very different from the murals that the Mexican muralists created. Let's go to the next picture. So the murals in our capital, when do they show that our history starts? Well, it starts with when the white men arrive. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have Father Dominguez and Father Escalante, who passed through our area for a month in 1776, and they were white. Then on the right, we have John Fremont, who also passed through our area, and he gets a mural of the first time he saw the Great Salt Lake. Then we have Peter Skeen Ogden, who was in the area on business for a year or two. He gets a mural. He also gets a city named after him, Ogden. And then bottom right-hand corner, we have Brigham Young and the pioneers, who clearly came and stayed. So indigenous people only show up in these murals as curious onlookers or passive people sitting on the ground up on the upper left-hand corner with when the white men are dominating. Let's go to the next picture. But nothing to worry about because we had peace with the Indians. So we have, oh, I'm sorry, this was just upper right-hand corner are the indigenous people sitting on the ground, and the bottom left-hand corner are indigenous people half naked looking out at the Pony Express. So next one is peace with the Indians. So peace with the Indians looks like things are all good, but James may later tell us otherwise. So why did Utah decide to create a short history and a happy story of white men and peaceful Indians and showing no conflict? According to W. Paul Reeve, who's the Simmons Professor of Mormon Studies at the University of Utah, when the Mormon pioneers arrived in our area in 1847, they began an effort to supercharge their whiteness. Coming to the West, prior to coming, they had been denigrated. They had been called an inferior race, the Mormons, even though they were European white people. They had been called the worst thing you could call someone at the time, and that was non-white. So when they reached our valley, they turned this treatment on non-whites, and they tried to be super white in an attempt to be American. Because as Fanny pointed out, being American is being racist. The book by Professor Reeve is called Religion of a Different Color. It's Oxford University Press, 2015. So the Mormon interaction with the Native Americans, according to Reeve, was not like this, peace with the Indians. It involved extermination, efforts at removal, and characterizations by Brigham Young that the Native Americans were ignorant, degraded, filthy, and barbarians. This was the same language that had been used against the Mormons. But we needed to show peace with the Indians to be accepted as part of the US and to achieve statehood. So we here in Utah had to be really white and really racist to become part of the US because this was Mexico. Let's look at the next picture. So like the big manifest destiny, our local manifest destiny, we had to show that we conquered the wilderness and we civilized people. So we brought railroads, we brought irrigation, and we brought mining. In the manifest destiny, as Fanny pointed out, was about greed. It was about personal property. In the Mormon manifest destiny, it was about the cooperative society. So it was more for cooperative wealth than personal wealth. Let's go to the next picture. So another important aspect of the Mormon manifest destiny is that the Mormon pioneers wandered out west until God told them to stop. And that's our This Is the Place monument. And that the Mormon pioneers came to Utah. So throughout Utah, we're going to see these maps, the Mormon journey to Utah, Pioneer Day, Illinois to Utah. And this is the timeline that was at the state capitol when I was there in 2017. It doesn't even mention 1848. It's Utah in 1847. It's inhabited by Native Americans. And miraculously, it's the territory of Utah in 1850. So according to Professor Reeve, the Mormons in Nauvoo, they had already zeroed in on the Salt Lake Valley as a place to settle because Mexico was weak. So this valley was their destination and Mexico was the destination. Try saying the Mormon pioneers arrived in Mexico next year if we're lucky enough to have our 24th of July parade. For those of you outside the state, it's our wonderful state celebration. I get paid off work that day. Schools are closed. We celebrate our Utah history, but it begins in 1847 when this was Mexico. If you say, gosh darn it, the pioneers came to Mexico, watch out. Professor Armando Solorzano at the University of Utah has received over 100 death threats saying that the Mormon pioneers came to Mexico. Let's look at the next slide. However, Professor Singer pointed out that the map that's part of the Doctrine and Covenants actually does show the Mormon, important Mormon scripture book, does show that the Mormon pioneers came to Mexico. But in the state capital, there's only a little hint, and that is the planting of the US flag on Ensign Peak. Why would you plant the US flag if you were in the US? The Mormons came to Mexico. It's just hard, it doesn't roll off the tongue. It's a little hard to say. But these myths, really, they are pounded into our being. They come to us through textbooks, through maps, through public holidays, public art, songs, dances. They are more powerful than the truth. They actually make you doubt the truth. Before I went to kindergarten here in Salt Lake, I knew I was going to burn in hell. When the teachers divided the Mormon kids on one side of the classroom and the non-Mormon kids on the other, so they knew who not to play with, I knew I was inferior, and I knew I didn't belong here. I knew my history was not part of Utah history or at all relevant to our identity. And one paragraph in a high school textbook does not dislodge the myths. My parents encouraged us to question myths. We didn't make a lot of friends that way. In the public schools, it was suggested that I could leave. I'm still told that. And I could leave. I was a privileged white person. I left Utah when I was 17. I went to the Mexican border. I enrolled in college. I went to Mexico City. I didn't walk. I went to Mexico City and enrolled in the National University. And then I went to law school so I could get paid to argue. But these myths, they still hurt. It hurt me most when my daughter first experienced racism. She's Mexican. I raised her to be proud to have dual citizenship. But a kid said a racist comment to her. She was 7 years old, my daughter, and I saw her face drop, and I must have seen her heart drop because I thought it's the end of innocence. Now she's understanding the racism of our country. And I also wanted to say that there are people listening tonight who've experienced this racism that underlines these myths in a devastating way they have suffered from generation to generation. So I want to acknowledge the pain that this racism that underlines our myths of the US and Utah have caused people. I also want to say I'm grateful for this huge wake-up call we're having in our country today, challenging these very carefully constructed myths that maintain the power of the few and the racism that they're based on, that have told people they're second class or they're worthless and that they and their histories don't matter in our state or our country. So a little history lesson before I turn it over to Fanny, and that's how did we manage our Sea to Shining Sea expansion given this map? Well, what I learned is that there was a little border skirmish down on the Mexican border. There was a short war with Mexico, and then Mexico agreed generously to sell us half of their territory. That was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Go us. Fanny, what did you learn? Did you learn something different in Mexico growing up? How did you feel about what we got from God?
Can we go to the next slide?
Yes.
Yeah, well, actually, let's go to the next one. This is pretty significant. So while I talk, I will let you look at this painting. The other day, I hear someone saying that July 24th, Pioneer Day, should be called the Manifest Destiny Day. This is someone from Utah who is a minority and who was questioning the celebration of July 24th. So just, I thought it was interesting that as I was preparing for this class, I hear this. So no, in Mexico, we never learned this as a God's will, never as an act of providence. In fact, at a school in Mexico, I learned about it as an evil act that left really deep scar in our history. So as you start touching on this subject with any Mexican, when you say, oh, the Mexican-American War, no, it's not called the Mexican-American War. In Mexico, it's called the American invasion. And then they will always end with the sentence, the stolen land, el territorio robado. So to a certain degree, it is true that Mexicans, we carry a deep, I would say resentment towards Americans for this period of our history. As I learned about this history period and as I was preparing for this class, I do have to say that it makes me sad that while these fights were taking place, I did not learn in Mexico that of those who were inhabiting the territories that were the Native American nations. I learned from the language school that they were just Indians, isolated tribes, Indians that occupy that territory, and that's why Mexico claimed it as a territory. And then the settlers and the Americans came, and they took the right to take it as well. I did not learn that at school, and I am ashamed for that because I came to the US to learn that. The other day, I asked a high schooler about this painting that we're seeing on the screen, and she said, she's a Mexican-American student, and she said, I see devastation, I see pain, and I see destruction. So for the representation of this painting is, it's a soldier from the army in Mexico. He is the boy falling, the devastating boy who is really interpreted as the young spirit of the new independent nation, which was only 26 years old by the time when Mexico's territory was taken by the Americans. The painting is by Gabriel Flores, painted in 1970. And it's a huge painting on the ceiling of the National History Museum in Mexico City. There are many symbolisms. Perhaps one of the most important ones is the horses. And the horses represent the apocalypses, implying that this war involved in a series of misfortunes for Mexico that nowadays we can still see.
So one thing I remember my dad said, he went to a small town in Mexico on the way to Copper Canyon, and the whole town was having a big celebration. He said, what is this about? It was the Niños Héroes. And he said he'd never heard of the Niños Héroes because we don't hear that point of view. We hear that we just had a little treaty with Mexico, or you sold us the land and boom, that was it. We don't learn about the devastation that Mexico has suffered. And the word
we have a holiday, which is September 13. Every September 13, we commemorate the American invasion of Mexico.
And you could call it the conquest. Sometimes you use the word conquest.
Well,
and that, we just call it was just a deal. It was a business deal. However, the Mormon battalion up by the, this is the place monument, it actually says, it refers to the conquest of Mexico was accomplished. We accomplished the conquest of Mexico. So
well,
Fanny.
I can see why, as I was reading and studying this subject, I learned that part of the success of the American troops arriving in Mexico City is because they took the same routes that Cortés took as they were arriving in Mexico City.
And I think that was a absolute a plan, because it just made that wound even deeper. We had to conquer Mexico to make a point. So Fanny, what do you say to people when they just say, well, history is history. Everybody's treated each other badly in history. Why don't we just move forward? Can't we just move forward?
As part of this reflection, I had a conversation with someone the other day in my family, and the response was, well, we're humans. We're all tribalistic. We make mistakes. It's part of the history. And I think that history has taught us that, yes, we are tribalistically, it's our human behavior, but isn't it that we pride ourselves on being civilized creatures? You know, I honestly think this is a way to justify our biases. As humans, we consider ourselves intelligent beings, but we still utilize our intelligence to satisfy our tribalistic needs. Race. There is only one race, and this is proved scientifically, the human race. Still, we classify and we separate ourselves by the color of our skin, by our economic and social political power. So historically, humans have taken pride in saying that the color of their skin is linked to their intelligence. So think of those who have been oppressed because of this way of thinking. Those have been fighting to be seen, fighting with their invisibility for being of color, for being poor, for being a minority. Unfortunately, and this is real, these situations we see in our present. Look what is happening right now with social justice movements. Every day, people of color have to push back against stereotypes as the way they are. Many children, many students, they haven't even defined themselves before they have been defined by stereotypes. There's a saying in the Black community that hit me the other day as I was reading this book. You've got to be twice as good to get half as far. It's painful.
Yeah. So let's look at the next slide. So Fanny, these are the words of our former Vice President of the US. And it's sometimes, if you read these, and some of us have read these for the first time studying this subject, and it's really horrible. And it also seems to be the absolute playbook that's being used today. When we read this type of language, how does it affect you, Fanny?
Well, you wonder why this historical resentment, right? How do we reframe our story in the US to recognize our side of the story? When I look at these painful phrases, I just question, right? Do they resonate to current events in our political environment? So 173 years later, Mexicans still appear to be the savages, the ignorant, the ones who bring drugs, who bring crime. So tell this to a children of Mexican immigrant, or a child or a family that identifies as Mexican American. Over and over again, they will think that they are not the chosen race, that they are lesser because they don't look like the American beauty, because they don't belong here.
So let's look at the next slide. And I want to ask Fanny, so what do you say? A lot of people here in Utah say, well, you know, like Salt Lake City especially, it's very diverse. Can't people, you know, people just fit in. We welcome people. What do you say to that about just fitting in?
I think there is a big difference, a big distinction between diversity and inclusion. I think it's obvious that our communities are becoming more diverse. That doesn't mean that they are becoming more inclusive. Students of colors, of different backgrounds, have to live with this every day. They are classified because of a stereotype. Students learn one narrative, and this portrays the principles, really, of white supremacy. It portrays in a certain way what doesn't contribute to a self-esteem. So this, I'm just gonna talk about this image quickly to move on. This image represents to me, feeling foreigner in your own land. This is a painting back from the 1865, was painted in Mexico City as the people, the Kikapus, had arrived in Mexico to ask for exile. They had been expelled from the US territory. They didn't want to be there anymore, and they came to the Mexican government. So what you see in this painting is Maximiliano, the French emperor, in the middle of the room, talking to these people. And I just wonder, whose living room looks like this one in Mexico back in the 1800s, when 90% of the population was indigenous? Whose home looks like this? Who looks Mexican on the right side? I don't doubt that there were Mexicans, but they were Mexicans that were assimilating to become Europeans, right? And the ones who look truly indigenous, truly Mexicans, are the outsiders, are the ones who are coming to ask for permission to be in that land.
So does this reflect something of how you think Mexicans feel here in the US, in the sense of like feeling like outsiders?
I think in many ways. I mean, the moment you are stereotyped by being Mexican or by being of color, you are immediately an outsider. I mean, how many times I have lived in this country for 25 years, and every day I get asked, where are you from? And I don't consider necessarily myself from here, but I am American and I am Mexican. So yeah, it's something that is real.
Let's look at the next picture. So Fanny, this is one of Fanny's favorite paintings on the right. She has it in her house. And we use it a lot in our classes. And then the one on the left is a Costa painting. And that we use that a lot in talking about race. We use it in our the podcast that Artes de México has. So one of the questions I have for Fanny is, so in Mexico, this is a constant, this conflict between the Spanish and the indigenous, the pain, the violence. It's something that's discussed all the time. It's in the art, it's in the conversation, it's in the literature. In the Costa paintings, which is from the Enlightenment era, when the scientists love to put people into categories, that also is something that's discussed a lot in Mexico. Do you think here in the US, we're just now opening that Pandora's box of racism? We've hidden it up, we haven't talked about it, and we're now just having to face some really uncomfortable and violent truths.
Yes, I think in many ways we have been taught to absorb the American Beauty way, right? The first painting that we had, that's the way we have to absorb, the way we learned. Yes, this painting is significant to me because I am mestizo. I am of indigenous origin, but also from Spanish. So when I look at this painting, is part of my history, is the painful history that I carry in my blood. However, you know, that most of the population of Mexico are part indigenous of Spanish, and that's what we call to be mestizo, right? It's a painful mix that was created between the Spanish and the indigenous people. The difference, I would say, between that and the United States is that there was not such a mix in the US. In the US, there was a genocide. There was the intention to kill the Indians. In Mexico, I don't know why. I mean, probably the Spanish gave up. Probably the Spanish decided that, well, you know, we better mix. I think, well, it's part of the history, actually. So that's a big difference, but that doesn't mean that it's not painful still, because in my personal case, I grew up with a family that would acknowledge in many ways more my Spanish heritage. It was until I moved to the United States that I decided to recover part of the family that I grew up looking indigenous and was kind of isolated in many ways.
So one thing that's interesting is in the Costa system, you could improve your position by becoming whiter. So you could marry up and become whiter and have more opportunities.
When I told my parents that I was marrying a white American from Utah, one of my family members, the first thing that she said was, "Oh, you're improving our race." My family.
One of the, you know, with the Utah overlay that I've been talking about, I grew up listening to a whole lot of talk about what level of heaven people were going to be in the afterlife. So there was a lot of chatter in high school about what level of heaven you were going to be in, depending on who you married. And I wasn't Mormon, and so I didn't pay any attention to it. But I had Mormon friends say that they had been told since they're not Mormon, they're not good enough Mormons, they're going to be polishing other people's shoes in the celestial kingdom. So.
Well, I had a comment that said that my husband was meant to marry a Mexican so I could redeem myself on him.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
So let's go to the next picture. I know this is one that Fanny really is passionate about too, and this is La Patria, right?
Yeah, well, this is the last image I want to discuss. And, you know, as I was analyzing Manifest Destiny, Columbus, then I remember La Patria because I grew up with this image. The painter, muralist, Jorge González Camarena was commissioned by the Mexican government back in 1962 to create the cover for all the free textbooks in public education in Mexico. So I grew up with this image, and I remember, you know, just looking at her. I mean, she looks mostly indigenous. She carries the symbolisms of what Mexico represents: the eagle, the flag, the corn. And she is standing strong, and she's brown. She looks like me, or she looks like many people, most Mexicans, right? I have to say also that has been a controversial painting because she resembles the higher level of education. And you can imagine what is to have this book in a rural community where, other than the symbolisms of what it is to be indigenous or Mexican, none of the other symbols represent the true reality of what these people have as rights.
What are the other images, like the one underneath her book? What does that represent?
Yeah, so you can see here vegetables that are native to the Americans. You know, that's a recognition of that. And well, the wings that represent the freedom, the book that the artist said that she is carrying progress in a country that was newly industrialized, you know, early in the 20th century.
She looks more, she's got her feet on the ground versus our floating Columbia in our Manifest Destiny.
Yeah.
James, I think you had some thoughts on this one before we turn the time over to you.
Yeah, I was thinking, and we've discussed this. I just want to point that out that, you know, this is a lot of these different symbols here are co-optations of a lot of the indigenous, the cultivation of corn, right? I mean, this can only happen through human contact, and it was an invention that occurred over, you know, thousands of years, combined with beans and squash produce a kind of protein. And so this led to some very high standards of living for the indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, combined with a whole plethora of other kinds of agricultural products. You can see behind is the serpent in the eagle's beak. And that goes back to some of the origin myths of the Aztec, right? And it has now been co-opted or culturally appropriated to be a symbol of the new Mexican race. And so it is what I'll try to explain, another form of settler colonialism. But it's just interesting to see how this is an indigenous body, but it's only made to be worthy by having some kind of European schooling and presented in European fashion.
So did I mention that James is going to dismantle everything that Fanny and I have said? And we're just going to sit here and absorb this point of view that, because Fanny, I think Fanny has said, you know, she grew up with a very mestizo point of view in Mexico, and I grew up with the mainstream. And James, we're just going to stand aside now because you have so many things to say that we have not heard before. So we give you the floor, and we thank you for being here.
Thank you. I think the next slide is something to bring up, maybe. Yes, okay. Yate shike dosh she dene bilagana neshle kia ani bashichin besh bichahe dashche do washihe dashanale akotego dene neshle ahye. I want to thank Artes de México for inviting me to share my perspective on this topic. Muchas gracias por esta oportunidad. Espero que pueda compartir algo interesante y que podamos mejorar el entendimiento entre nuestras culturas. Also, thank you to the Utah Museum of Fine Arts for this collaboration and providing a forum for dialogue and understanding. As I mentioned, my name is James Courage Singer. I'm a sociologist by training and an educator by profession. I'm a citizen of the United States and a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I've spent most of my time here in this fourth world, the glittering world, walking upon the ancestral homelands of the Shoshone Taiwape, or the Shoshone, the Nooch, the Ute, and the Niwene, or the Goshute. I believe this is a moment for us to reflect upon the stories and narratives we've been force-fed since we were young and rarely question. I imagine what I have to say will be uncomfortable, maybe even controversial. It's a tone I usually don't like to take, but I really feel it's necessary, especially in the context of what we're talking about. In order for the US American story to work, Indigenous nations and people have to be obscured from the picture completely. Or if they are included, then focus must be centered on how Indigenous people contributed to the country's greatness or how they no longer exist. I think that these approaches are disingenuous. They are an insidious veil to obscure that glaring truth that the existence of the United States is a result of the violent plundering of an entire continent and its resources. This topic is personally very difficult for me to address, and it does take much emotional labor to revisit, but I believe it's important to face the darkness and push through. Not that there's any predestined light at the end to resolve the darkness, but that without this acknowledgement of the past, the generational trauma that my people and myself experience would go unrecognized. So please forgive me if I need to take pauses every now and then to compose myself. I do find it shameful that what I want to share with you today is not taught in our schools. In its place, a form of propaganda that socializes us to take part in a distorted nationalism. All societies do this, of course, but perhaps because of the values and ideals that the United States supposedly stands for, makes it all the more difficult. The value of democracy, for example, or a government constructed by the people and for the people. The value of freedom and liberty to choose one's life course, and the value of equality that no matter one's race, ethnicity, beliefs, religion, gender, sexuality, ability, and social class, that we stand equal before the law. The United States has always wrestled with the issues we're facing today. A society deeply divided by race and social class. A society divided by gender. Today you may have heard icons speak about how the United States is a racist society. And you've probably also heard other proponents pronounce that the United States is far from being racist. How we define racism will help to clarify these positions. Most US Americans believe that racism can only be interpersonal, or discrimination enacted by someone to another person based on race, and that racism has to be intentional. While interpersonal discrimination is not as outwardly apparent, it certainly has not ended. And our present moment is replete with instances of intentional interpersonal racism. But racism is not confined to these parameters alone. It need not be intentional. Racism can occur without someone meaning to be racist at all. Yes, we must acknowledge intentionality, but the focus must be on the outcomes. Racism is also built into the fabric of our society, from tropes and ideas to social institutions like the criminal justice system or education system. These social institutions enshrine policies that have divided and continue to divide us along racial and ethnic lines. It's no surprise that race and class are intertwined so closely. US society has done this by design. And despite our best intentions at a personal level, the legacy of racism is deeply embedded in social structures far bigger than any one person. Structural racism's effects are far-reaching and profound. The structure I wish to focus on tonight in my address is the concept of settler colonialism. Anthropologist and ethnographer Peter Wolf describes it this way. Settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. It strives for the dissolution of native societies. Settler colonialism destroys to replace. What does it mean that settler colonialism is a structure and not an event? Well, an event is something that has a finite beginning and end. As a structure, it means it's an ongoing process with all aspects of society constructed to uphold an ideology and make it material, to make it real in the physical sense. Manifest destiny, as we're talking about tonight, is a form of settler colonialism. It is the divine right for this nation to spread across the entire continent from one coast to the other. It's an inevitability. It's predestined. Now is this accomplished? Well, central to this ideology is land. And indigenous people obstructed settlers' access to that land. Therefore, one of the primary tenets of this ideology is the logic of elimination. The indigenous peoples who stood in the way, the roughly 550 nations that stretched across what is now called the United States, were not, as Wolf continues to write, killed, terrorized, romanticized, fenced in, and bred white as original owners of the land. They were eliminated as Indians. They were a foreign other. The primary motive for elimination is not race or religion, ethnicity, or grade of civilization, but access to territory. Elimination is the organizing principle of settler colonial society. This is accomplished through breeding out the Indian, breaking native title to land into individual parcels, child abduction, religious conversion, resocialization in total institutions such as missions, or in the picture depicted here, in boarding schools, and a whole range of related biocultural assimilations. Now, all of these coupled with indiscriminate murder are characteristics of settler colonialism. By our current international definitions, what has happened here is a case of genocide, or rather, cases of genocide. Historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz describes it this way. She says, the objective of US colonialist authorities was to terminate their existence as peoples, not as random individuals. She goes on to say that the United States is a socioeconomic and political entity as one is a result of this centuries-long and ongoing colonial process. This is the reality of the situation. Okay. Without understanding this concept, US history makes no sense. The fundamental problem we face in understanding the United States of America is the exclusion of the settler colonial framework. So the painting then of Columbia leading the US American people across the land is wholly duplicitous and dishonest. It is deceitful and fraudulent. It depicts Indians fleeing before the settler onslaught. But as a system, settler colonialism requires violence. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz discerns that people do not willingly hand over their homelands, their children, their futures. Their pasts, their resources, both cultural and physical, without a fight. The glaring exclusion from that painting is the incredible violence that has taken place across the whole of this continent and continues to take place now. Can we go to the next slide? I think an illustrative juxtaposition is the painting of the Long Walk here, when from 1864 to 1866, the US Army forced the Navajo in 53 distinct marches to Huelde, or Bosque Redondo in New Mexico, which was between 250 and 450 miles away. If you fell on the way over, you were dead. And this after an extended brutal military campaign with indiscriminate killings and a scorched earth policy of warfare. Now, yes, the United States is not alone in its use of settler colonialism as a structure and policy framework. Throughout the world, we've seen it in action in Australia, New Zealand, throughout Africa, even in Mesoamerica and South America. That same pompous European supremacism is embedded within the nations that emerged from the American Spanish Empire. I spent time living in Argentina. where elimination of the native had been, and I would argue still is, the prevailing logic. Although lands were inhabited, controlled, owned by the Mapuche nation, the Tehuelche nation, the Guarani, it was not their land. So in a sense, I do have to contradict what my esteemed colleagues have said in saying that the present day Utah was part of Mexico. I claim that it's not. I acknowledge that Spain and then later Mexico laid claims to the lands where the Navajo, the Utes, the Paiutes, the Shoshone, and Goshutes lived, but we were never militarily conquered by either of those nations. We lived as autonomous societies. History shows that we weren't isolated from Mexico. Indigenous nations engaged in trade and commerce for a couple hundred years. But to say that Mexico controlled my ancestors and their lands merely perpetuates the myth and logic of settler colonialism. Likewise to my US Americans, Utah did not instantly become the United States in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Conflict between primarily Mormon settler colonists and the indigenous peoples was an extended affair lasting for decades. In 1861, President Lincoln, through an executive order, sectioned off indigenous lands for the United States unilaterally and without compensation, which are violations of the very laws the emerging nation had created for themselves. The Indians, of course, rejected this act, and it would still be a few more decades before Native nations would succumb to signing treaties coerced with threat of violence. These land disputes have not ended. They continue to this day. So long as indigenous nations exist, their claims to their lands are valid. One of the most recent battles in Utah fought by lawyers and not US soldiers is Bears Ears in San Juan County. The entire situation reeks of settler colonialism and white supremacy. It will continue to be a site of contention for the foreseeable future. Central to this conflict is, of course, land, in addition to the logic of eliminating the native from it. Dispossession brings with it a shift in identity. The settler colonizer must become the new native to the land. And this is very apparent in the establishment of firsts, right? The first city plats, the first home erected, the first school, the first road, the first railways, the first church, the first ward, the first temple, the first tabernacle, the first orchard, the first agricultural field, the first site of the future settlement. Enshrined in Utah is a story of Brigham Young entering the valley and proclaiming, "This is the place." Additionally, the new nativity is marked by the last Indian village, the last treaty signed, the last of the Mohicans, the last Indian battle, the end of the trail. Part of how the settler colonizer becomes the new native is to claim an inherent tie to the land through genetic inheritance. I am 1/16 Cherokee, or I have some Indian blood, but not sure how much or how little. Or my great-great-great-grandmother was a Potawatomi princess. Or an Indian adopted my ancestors into the tribe and said we could live here forever. The absurdity is present in the fact that if I were to claim that my limited Swedish heritage gives me an undisputed right to claim nativity in Sweden, and any piece of land I deem suitable for my needs flips this logic on its head. The settler colonizer's justification for land dispossession is an ideological one. They say, we can use the land better than they can. So this is a form of productive labor and transformation that justifies the occupation. They say, we've built cities, we've cultivated fields where there was none, we built irrigation ditches, we built power lines, we mine coal, we drill for oil and gas, we dam rivers and build pipelines. Yes, you have done all of that. You have amassed wealth on stolen land. You have exploited it for your gain at the expense of the poverty and oppression of indigenous peoples. You've committed genocide and engaged in an exploitative economic system that indeed has brought about all of your material goods and wealth. Your large houses filled with stuff made in China and India and Bangladesh and Mexico, externalizing the costs of environmental degradation, of an exploitative worker-owner relationship, of corporate colonialism, and the squelching of democracy, ironically, in the name of free markets and free trade. This is a system focused on consumption and eliminates the processes of production and labor and what happens to our stuff once it's sent to the rubbish bin. Instead of the Judeo-Christian God who blessed manifest destiny, we now have the God of money and the God of Wall Street. To conclude, I will say that the history of the United States is full of hypocrisy. Until 1924, Indians, as we're still erroneously referred to even today, were not considered full members of US society. That was the year the US unilaterally extended citizenship to indigenous peoples, and how we became first Americans, even though we were the last. And it wasn't until 1962 that the last state in the Union allowed Native peoples the right to vote. That final state? Yes, Utah. Indeed, US history betrays our values and our morality. It proclaims liberty, equality, and democracy, but they had been designed and intended only for a small group of people. Every right, every claim to liberty, to equality, and to democracy from groups outside that designated original group has been won with decades of continual struggle. It's been met with violence, with subjugation, with the use of the full power and weight of the US government and its systems. Until we contend with this history, we will continue the logic of elimination, will continue to lie to ourselves. So my fellow educators, you must describe the events as they unfolded in the past and how the consequences are a very real part of the lives we live today. Settler colonialism has not ended. It's a structure that is alive and well. You are living on stolen land. You are part of a society that has amassed wealth due to genocide and slavery. To live up to the ideals of democracy, of equality and liberty requires you to abandon the myth. Leaving out this important structure from our history, settler colonialism, means we continue to live the fallacy. It means we've chosen white supremacy, and it means we may like the idea of a democratic, free, and equal society, but that we're unwilling to do anything to bring that about. The only sincere and complete justice is decolonization. And what an uncomfortable thought. This painting, to me, of Colombia is the embodiment of settler colonialism. It's the obstruction of truth. It's the hiding of the violence. It's the concealment of genocide. It's the masking of hypocrisy. It's a pathetic piece of propaganda. It angers me, and it fills me with disgust. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to suggest a little change of the way we wrap this up, because listening to James, I just want to sit here and join in your sorrow. I think let's just go to Q&A maybe. I just also want to say that the degradation of our environment could be why we're in the situation we are today with this pandemic. When you talk about consequences of destroying the environment and putting our the wheels of our capitalist machinery in place to the expense of everything else. But let's just go to Q&A, because I think people are going to have a lot to say, a lot of comments. And yeah. I was going to try to end on a really happy note, but I don't feel like it right now. I feel like
Susan, if I may, I would, yes. As painful as it is for all of us, as a Mexican immigrant, as I said earlier, I had to move out of my country, be in a situation of discomfort, to learn this from a perspective that not only makes me Mexican or mestizo, but also American, a true American recognizing the true history of the United States. I'm thankful for James, because this is the book that I've been reading every night, and it hits me so much. This is the t-shirt that my son got, and I got into an argument in a store because it says that Utah was established in 1847. And I have to say, the man was really nice about it. But when we talk about the positive encouragement of what we're talking here, I mean, look at how we started this conversation. We started this conversation with the land acknowledgement. When in the past we did that, when a museum did that before? We are in a process of change, and I'm thankful for these institutions, for this space provided by the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, with the honest intention and empathy to include the voices of our communities. And thankful to you, the audience, for taking the time to listen to this different perspective of how we interpret our history, our stories, and our struggles. Working for Artes de México in Utah has given me the opportunity to meet so many people, institutions that are eager really to work through a real change. We have worked with teachers that move aside their regular curriculum, invite us to come over to be part of their interactive class to talk about this. And I'm thankful for these teachers, for these community partners that really are taking a step to think in a different way. And I want to finish with this sense of discomfort that makes us grow, that teaches. I hope everybody goes tonight with this intention of change, much needed change.
Thank you, Fanny. Should we go to Q&A? We usually try to give some time for people to ask questions. Should we go ahead and do that, Jorge?
Excuse me, yes.
Great.
Let's do that. Before we get into some questions here, I just want to acknowledge the difficult subject matter and offer my gratitude to our presenters for being present, for offering their personal views and perspectives, and for bringing their full selves and passions to their presentations. I also want to thank you for connecting the history of Manifest Destiny to current affairs and issues. James, I just want to say as a fellow educator, I especially respect and appreciate your call to all educators to correct the dishonest narratives that we've been taught and have been perpetuating. I'm deeply moved and by all of your perspectives. That's one of my favorite things about these classes, which Artes de México has been presenting for quite some time. One of our guests is asking what the book is, and it's An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar. So yes, I can't thank you all enough. I was saying that one of my favorite things about these classes that Artes de México has been offering for years now is the various perspectives that you bring to the conversation, to hear Susan's perspective, to hear Fanny's perspective, to hear James' perspective. It's just, I can't think of a better way of providing, a broad look into this difficult material. So I'm going to go ahead and read some of the comments and questions. I'll start by acknowledging a comment from Melissa Valentin, who is with us tonight. Melissa wanted to make a comment around the topic of white saviorism. Melissa says, accepting that the white man created conflict as well as disrupted an already established community in Utah, the American Indian tribes, did not fit the Eurocentric narrative of white saviorism. If history is presented accurately, then white saviorism loses its validity. I think that's just absolutely true and right on. Kevin Doyle, who's also with us this evening, asked the question. He says, I have known about the Mormon colonies in Mexico and Canada. Do they go back to the beginning of migration? Susan, I know you're quite knowledgeable about this topic.
Well, you are too, Jorge.
Maybe you'd like, yes, I am, but I'm just gonna facilitate the conversation for this one, but okay. Thank you. And maybe, yeah, and I'd love to hear from all of you on that.
So I'm not an expert on history, but my understanding is that when Utah became a state, we had to get rid of polygamy, and people who wanted to continue with polygamy returned to Mexico. So that would be another chance to say thank you, Mexico, for giving us a place of refuge when we wanted to practice our religion. And the Mormon colonies were established, and they were allowed. Porfirio Diaz welcomed the colonists in Chihuahua, and they were there. A lot of people left during the revolution, but they continue to be there. And I think some people have a deeper knowledge of life there than others, but they're still there. I've been there. They're like a little slice of Salt Lake City with the brick buildings and the Mormon churches. And, you know, they even have the grapes that I have here on my table. Every house in Utah growing up had the resin grapes, and they had those in the colonies in Chihuahua as well. So.
Thank you. Well, I guess while I'm at it, I guess I will say, you know, my grandfather was one of the, on the Taylor side of my family, was one of the colonists in Las Colonias in Chihuahua, Mexico. So they moved from here, from Utah, to escape persecution and to start their colonies. They also provided arms and food and support for Pancho Villa's army. So there's a very rich history there. So maybe we can do a class about that.
And they were in support of the Mexican Revolution because it was the best thing for the people.
Yes. Let's go to the next question. And this is to whoever wants to pick this up. So Fanny, you showed us a painting. I believe you said it's the Kikipu people in Mexico. What do we know about, and James, you talked a little bit about this, but what do we know about the Mexican inhabitants in this territory that's now owned by the US? And what do we know about the relationship between what are now known as Mexican and Native American peoples? I think you're muted, James.
A great question. I think there's a rich history between these different cultures. I think a lot of it's centered in, you know, California and in New Mexico. The Pueblo Indians, they had extensive relations with Mexico. I mean, this was a base of operations. They integrated it into some way by getting land titles that were deeded out by the Spanish and Mexican governments. But in 1680, there was a Pueblo revolt, and you know, they overcame their Spanish and Mexican overlords. But there was a swift retribution that followed, and so this changed the balance of power, at least in the Southwest region. But it also spread a lot of that Pueblo history and culture to the surrounding tribes that existed there. There was slave trading that happened. The different tribes would steal each other's people. They'd be sold into slavery in Mexico. In fact, one of my great grandfathers in the 1840s, I believe, his sisters were actually taken into slavery, and they were sold into northern Mexico. And interestingly, through the Ancestry.com, someone else took a DNA test, and I found those distant cousins. They wanted to know how we were related, and I told them, your ancestors were stolen and sold, and that's how we're related. But as far as Mexico goes, or as far as Utah goes, you know, there weren't any really permanent colonies that were here. A lot of the sites that they found for future colonies were actually Indian villages that were there. So this place was replete with lots of people. Those future sites became a lot of the sites for the settlements that we see today. And so we can thank Father Escalante and that journey by marking all those places for where it would be. So just a little bit. I'm not so familiar with California and its history, but I know that was another site of a lot of interchange, I guess you could say.
Thank you, James. Speaking of Escalante, a comment from and Carolina Blom says, as we talk about rewriting history, just to point out that phrase Silvestre Velez de Escalante, Velez is the paternal last name. And when now we look at how it is perpetuated in Utah, toponyms, it is Escalante, the name that's stuck. I'd like to go on to the next question that I have for you all. So thank you for making that distinction about settler colonialism, James, earlier on, and how it destroys to replace, and how it is a structure, not an event. I think that that's really important frame to think about this history. Clearly, Manifest Destiny has deeply affected Mexico, and of course, Native peoples. Its territories, its cultures, in every possible way, its traditions. For those who are new to these perspectives that you're offering, I wonder if you could share your views and experiences on how this history of Manifest Destiny continues to manifest itself in our times.
Racism, in a word. I mean, I think when you dig, if you even look at this today, especially the new materials, the book that James suggested that has really affected me, you know, it's just looking at, if you look at the words that people use, it's inherently racist. I mean, it's people choosing that they're better than others and saying that's God's will. It's really quite horrifying. It really it shakes up our everything that I've learned about history is being questioned, and rightfully so. So for me, it's liberating, because when you lie to people, there's something wrong with it. There's something wrong with being lied to, and we know it's wrong. And so once we take those lies away and the myths away, it's refreshing to be able to face the truth. But the myths take over our brain. And so, like I said, they don't even a little bit of truth. You keep saying the Mormons came to Utah, the Mormons came to Utah, the Mormons came to Utah. To dislodge that is really difficult. We have to work at dislodging the myths that we've grown up with.
I would like to add, and my opinion goes towards the feelings of so many students and community members that we have known through these classes. When we attended the MECHA conference last year at the University of Utah, we had students crying as we talked about these issues. I mean, we're talking about high schoolers or first year college, right? The students of Mexican descendants saying, I have never felt enough Mexican, and I don't feel enough American. I don't know where I fit. And these are mostly students of color. They are trying to find their place in the place where they were born. We don't know if they will find their place in Mexico. Maybe they will never go back. Maybe they don't have the chance to go because of their legal status. They are Americans. They don't feel American, enough Americans. And that's very painful, because as our minority population grows, the minority population grows, these issues also grow. We have to concentrate in a true issue of inclusion and look at our neighbors, look at our communities, how they are evolving, how are they changing, and how we embrace these changes in our schools, in our conversations with your children, in the conversations with our students, as we integrate these elements of our history. It's a moral obligation to change the course of our history. Teachers, students, parents, community partners, museums, every single one, we have an obligation to make that change in our language, in our conversations, in our sense of discomfort, to make these students, these children, give them that sense of belonging.
Yeah, I think some other examples of Manifest Destiny today is, you know, we see that this structure is still very apparent. I mean, I was talking to Fanny and Susan as we were going through this, and I was mentioning federal Indian law, which was basically, it's kind of, this is my opinion on it, it's basically made up as they go to make sure that power is still concentrated into the federal government. So actually the recent case in Oklahoma, it was surprising that it's turned out that way. But I imagine Manifest Destiny will shroud its terrible, blanket of lies and deception over it to make it different. I think another part of this, since Manifest Destiny or Select Colonialism uses violence in a way. We see this right now with the acquisition of different kinds of resources, or the transportation of natural resources on Indian lands. It invites a lot of non-native folks into these communities, and because of the differences in jurisdiction between tribal governments and the federal governments and state governments and county governments, that gray area offers opportunities for human trafficking, for sexual violence. And so we have, some say an epidemic. I would call it a major social issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Women are our strength for Indigenous people. And so to target that is targeting a huge part of our culture, our identity. Salt Lake City has been identified as one of the top 10 cities in the United States where this is happening. And that's, looking at data that isn't well documented. And I just think it continues to, I mentioned Bears Ears as well, but all of these ways in which we look at how land is managed, how we look at processes of production of our relations to one another and to the land. What we have here now is still that manifest destiny. Take, use, consume as much as possible, and then move on, keep moving. The thing is, there's nowhere else to move to. There's nowhere else to go. I think the narrowness of manifest destiny thinks that there is an endless supply of land. There's one planet, and this is the only one that can support life for us, and we're destroying it. And I think that's part of manifest destiny.
Yeah, it sure is. I'm gonna read one comment from our participants, and then I'm gonna end with a question. And then I think we're running out of time. So thank you so much to everybody, to our participants for being here. There's more questions than we're able to get to tonight, but I'd like to end with this one. First of all, from Brian Hartman, he said he wanted to point out from A People's History of the United States, which is certainly a book that everyone should read. He says, elites instituted policies designed to drive poor whites, Native Americans, and Black slaves apart, and used them as a check upon one another. He refers to this conversation as one that can acknowledge and unify as well. So I'm going to use that comment and then lead into a question from Sara Zuniga. I want to just involve as many people as possible. Sara Zuniga, also thank you for joining us. And her question, which I think is directly related to the last comment, and I think it's one we can all relate to, at least on this panel, and that is, what are your feelings about how the Mexican-American conquest and war, in other words, manifest destiny, how do you feel about how it left this own racism built into Mexico and into Native peoples, making us discriminate ourselves and each other?
I would like to give a comment, if you allow me quickly. Growing up in Mexico, there was always the distinction of being brown, but being light brown, right? I am brown, but I am not fully brown. I am light brown, so I have more privilege. And this is a point that Octavio Paz, the famous Mexican writer, talks about. We as Mexicans, we almost carry this gene that identifies us as this terrible legacy of racism implemented by the Spanish, because indigenous, we carry the idea that looking indigenous is being less. And in Mexico is very predominant, I would say, especially in industrialized cities, where the lighter you are, the more opportunities you have. The darker you are, the more abused you become, you are, I'm sorry. So it is a reality. And that's what I said at the beginning of this conversation. We might classify ourselves by the light brown color, but when you move to the US, the white Americans don't care, you still look Mexican. And that puts you in a situation of discomfort to evaluate yourself. At least in my case, that's the process that I've been going through. And tell my family that this matters when you live in and when you feel as an outsider in another country.
Quickly to comment on that idea. I think, I mean, I've definitely felt the racism in Latin America to some degree, right, when I lived there. But I think what's interesting is that this racism is then internalized as people of color. That the whole structure is there to maintain a system of power, and it uses ideology to do that. So ideology meaning here's a way of thinking and being, explains cause and effect. And so we idolize elites, we idolize the successful and whatever those cultural goals are. And we want to emulate that. And yet the system itself prevents us from ever arriving to that station, to that place, yet we continue to participate in it. So I would say that race is only a component part of this larger ideological framework, that social class and gender and sexuality and ability, all of these different identities, I guess, intersect. And this is what creates, I mean, these very complex relationships. It's hard to be, you know, on one side I'll be told, well, you don't look Indian, or you don't look Indian enough. Why don't you speak your native language? And then on the other side, you know, I can't pass for white either, right? So there's that internal conflict that happens for a lot of, I think, people of color, where it's the self-loathing, right, of these expectations that are put upon us, which we don't have to buy into. This is the beauty of social constructionism, is it only has power as much as we believe it and make it real, right? Change happens when we question those, when we start to undermine it, when we change those norms. And I think, I mean, that is the way for change. That is the way forward, is to make sure that we're speaking truth to power and start to deconstruct those systems which keep us oppressed.
And I'm learning so much from James, and I really appreciate your wisdom and talking about races as such an artificial construct, like saying that, you know, people are, God says that if your little finger is longer than your, you know, someone else's, you're better than others. It's so arbitrary, but we keep buying into it. I mean, the English brought racism over from the way they treated the Irish who were white. So it's so malleable. It can be, and then to have it used against the Mormons who were white. So, you know, using race. So it's a tool that people want to use just to put people down in almost any setting. And we do buy into it. So that's probably the beginning, is realizing how arbitrary it is and trying to avoid using it in any way. But I'm just happy to learn more about it and to have opportunities to hear different perspectives. And I hope that we all can take this opportunity to learn more and really learn about our history, because it's very, very troubling. And I think we do have the power to start educating people and to see things in a different way and make choices in a different way. So I really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'd like to end by just reading one more comment by another wonderful friend and community member, Suyin Chung, who many of you know. You know, this is a parent's perspective that she's offering here, and many of us who are parents and from you know, that have migrated to the United States and who are raising children in this country. You know, I think this is just a very hopeful note to end on. So I'd like to read this and share this with you. Su Yin Chong says, I think we as parents try so hard to make our kids feel proud of their roots that sometimes we forget to also assure them that this is their country, and they belong here. They have rights and responsibilities, and they grow with this lack of belonging. Thank you all for this amazing, heartfelt, and honest conversation. The UMFA is deeply grateful to all of you for your time, for your knowledge, for your for sharing your experiences and perspectives with our community. So I just want to thank all of our participants, everyone that's attended this Mexican class. I just want to say, as a member of the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, we're deeply grateful for a year-long partnership with Artes de México, where we have learned so much from our partners about how to be, how to be a better organization that extends in meaningful ways to our community, how to listen to our community members, and how to provide and share authority and really make sure that we're allowing space for different perspectives and from different voices in our community. So on behalf of the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, and if I can say from Artes de México in Utah, thank you all for a wonderful presentation. Good night.
Thank you.